Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the War for BADAB. Last week we saw the destruction of the Lamenter chapter at the hands of the Minotaurs in a costly and lengthy combined fleet and ground engagement. Having crippled the Lamenter's capital battle barge, the Sons of Sanguinius had no choice but to stand and defend their most vital of objectives, their wounded battle brothers and their reserve of gene seed, allowing the Minotaurs to finally tie them down and gore them upon their horns. It was not an engagement that came cheap for the Minotaurs, having been reduced to nearly half their fighting strength. But at the end of the day, it also left the Lamenters as a non-entity in the war. 311 were all that remained, and they were at the Legate Inquisitor Jarndyce Freyne's mercy, aboard a prison hulk circling the recently reconquered Sagan system. It was a much-needed morale boost for the Loyalists, and their clearest victory to date in a war that at times had seen lost and at others unending. A sense of genuine optimism was beginning to spread through the halls of Vengeance Station, and Carab Cullen was even reported to have cracked a smile at some point. An indeterminate point, mind you, but nevertheless the rumors were there. However, overconfidence was going to lead to a brand new set of problems for the Loyalists in what would eventually become known as the Angstrom incident. One of the most contentious and, in many ways, interesting parts of the BADAB war overall, at the very least from the perspective of Imperial politics. For you see, Angstrom was a neutral world, an independent planet in the autonomous zone. With all the action going on, you may be excused to think that the entirety of the autonomous zone was little more than a cloud of whizzing bolter fire and chainswords. But in reality, well, it's a very large place, and the majority of it was quite peaceful. As peaceful as any area of space infested by demons, marauders, pirates, and currently undergoing an Imperial civil war can be, anywho. As they say, all things are relative. As is, of course, advantage. For many worlds, their loyalty were never in question due to simple necessity. BADAB was never going to rise up against the tyrant, nor was Carthago against Tanith Koenig. Their neighboring systems were similarly doomed to compliance for the simple reason that they were far too close to one out of the two warring parties. Many other planets were loyal to the one or the other for various reasons. Many worlds within the autonomous zone, for example, had benefited hugely from the protection of the Warders and the Tyrant's Legion, and were eager to repay the favor. Many others held loyalty to the Imperium above all other loyalties, but yet more world viewed this as an Imperial conflict that they would really prefer to be left out of entirely. Now, some planets didn't have a choice. If they were in a strategically important location, for example, then sooner or later one side or another was going to show up and demand their fealty. Their only option then was to either surrender, the most likely option, or try to fight what was, in all due honesty, a massively superior foe. The worst things these worlds were supposed to be facing was the odd pirate raid, an invasion by Adeptus Astartes, a few levels above the pay grade of most PDF officers in the sector. The majority of these worlds affected a form of armed neutrality, where whichever party came knocking on their door last was the one they swore fealty to. If the planet found itself in Secessionist space, then all hail Lufthuron. The moment that flipped to Imperial space, however, the God Emperor was the only true ruler of the planet, and no doubt about it, and so on and so on. a stance often adopted as well by many of the less important planets. Those who were blessed with a non-strategically important position could pretty much just lean back, put their feet up on the table, and enjoy the tithes that they would normally have been required to ship off to the Imperium because nobody came around with a gun to threaten them into giving it up. In fact, for many planets, the whole war for BADAB was a little bit of a mini golden era. That lasted, of course, up until the point where either Loyalists or Secessionists moved into the system and decided to reaffirm the local populace's loyalty in the one and only cause via a demonstration of military might. Translation for the lay-minded amongst us: Dear random planet, you're shit out of luck. We're gonna bomb you now. Have a good day. Followed by loud exploding noises. But Angstrom was quite the exception in the midst of all of this. Oh, it was a strategic world, all right. In fact, it might just be the single most strategic world in the entirety of the Autonomous Zone, next to BADAB Primaris itself. For it was the single largest and most efficient forge world, not just in the Autonomous Zone. Oh no, this was perhaps the most important forge world in the entire Maelstrom Zone. All 4 sectors surrounding the warp storm. And it was independent too, not under Secessionist control or Loyalist control, whereas normally, of course, this world would have been of absolute paramount importance to both fighting parties. And yet, beyond the occasional verbal threat, neither side had made any overt move towards it. Until now, anyways. But why was that? Why was this incredibly bountiful planet ignored? Well, because it was an Adeptus Mechanicus forge world. A heavily fortified one at that, with massive regiments of Mechanicus Scitarii and a huge private fleet contingent under the command of the local Magos. It was a mini-empire within a mini-empire within a mini-empire. For yet further context, Sorengrad, the heavily fortified fortress world, could have been claimed by the Secessionists, and almost was via treachery, but if the full might of the warders descended upon the planet, they would probably have taken it. Angstrom? Even Huron wasn't sure he could crack that nut, even at the height of his power. So not only did Angstrom have the ephemeral political protection of the Red Planet, it also had more than enough military might to back it up, making sure that both sides had been giving the planet a wide berth up until this point. But the Loyalists were beginning to get a little bit sick of this idea, and, after all, they had just scored a major victory. Perhaps it was time to revisit the Angstrom question then. For whilst the planet was independent and not under direct secessionist control, it had a little bit of a quirk to it. The local Magos, like many of his kind, was an extremely literally minded person. The BADAB War was a conflict between 2 sides that both claimed to be imperial. Alright, well, that makes it an internal dispute then, doesn't it? And therefore, none of the Mechanicus' business. The Magos' only responsibility was to maintain the territorial integrity of his fiefdom and the fulfillment of an ancient trade obligation, where every 3 years, massive supplies of weapons and refined ores would be towed out to the extremities of the system and then handed over to whatever representative party came to pick them up. If they called themselves Loyalists or Secessionists, did not matter one iota to the Magos. Even when representatives of Legate Inquisitor John Dice Frayne and the Triumvirate arrived to pronounce their official sanction of the Astral Claws as excommunicatis traitoris, The Magus simply shrugged his oversized mechanical shoulders and reiterated his position. Internal matter. None of my business. If the Loyalists wanted his shipments, all they had to do was come pick it up. Although, of course, he also made clear that if any fighting started to take place within his territory, then he fully intended to take any and all violent measures required to protect the territorial integrity of his most sacred fiefdom. May the Omnissiah have mercy upon the souls of the trespassers, for my lance batteries will not. And these warnings had proven sufficient to keep the Secessionists out of the Angstrom system, and to a lesser degree the Loyalists, who hadn't really had the opportunity to access the system just yet. That is, up until now, of course, and the seizure of the Pale Stars. And whilst the Secessionists had respected Angstrom's territorial integrity, because, well, they still got their tithe every 3 years, and frankly, they had enough enemies without going looking for yet further opposition. The Loyalists, however, it was just around the time when another one of these tithe shipments was to be delivered. A tremendous quantity of weapons, munitions, and refined materiel. Just the sort of thing you would want if you were Lufthuron, busy fortifying your home system. Carab Cullen was thusly understandably eager to see such resources denied to the tyrant. And since the Magos had already rebuffed the Legate Inquisitor's diplomats, trying to convince the Magos to withhold the tithe shipments until the true servants of the God Emperor could arrive to pick it up, any operation to deny the tyrant of his resources would necessarily include military force. And more importantly, a great deal of tap dancing on a certain Magus's toes. The Legate Inquisitor was not at all overjoyed by this line of reasoning, since this would have far-reaching consequences. Worst case scenario, it might even push the Magos right into the arms of the Secessionists. But perhaps even more importantly was what the Legate Inquisitor left out of his objections. Namely that the Magos had the ear of a great deal of highly positioned officials back home on Terra. There was a very good reason why not merely the armies of Angstrom provided protection, but the name of the Mechanicus as well. In a sector where a great many Forge Worlds had already surrendered themselves to one belligerent party or another, Angstrom was the exception. And Frayne was not at all interested in finding out just how much clout the Magos might have outside of the autonomous zone. But Carab Cullen, as we all know, comes from a disobedient chapter. And whilst the Inquisitor was speaking, Carab Cullen was happily nodding his head. Yes, of course, the implications, the wider implications, the political implications, absolutely. It would be a right old shit show if we were to intervene. And then he called Captain Pelas Mirsan of the Salamanders into his office, turned on the privacy fields, and laid out his plans for a small elite task force to infiltrate the Angstrom system and ambush the Secessionists when they came for their package. I'm quite liking this Carab Cullen guy. And to be fair, this might not simply just be inquisitorial disobedience here. Jarndyce Frayne had been stepping on Carab Cullen's toes as well an awful lot as of late, favouring the Minotaurs, replacing several chapters that Carab Cullen thought solid, because there were doubts as to how dedicated they were, which in reality amounted to little more than a military coup against the Red Scorpion's chapter master. It was time for a little bit of Astartes vengeance. Perhaps a slight bit more roundabout than the kind of revenge the Scorpions usually dealt with, but revenge nevertheless. The more problematic question, though, was how to stop the transfer of goods. The Adeptus Mechanicus has quite a few toys that they keep relatively secret from the rest of the Imperium, and so Carib Cullen could assume with a great deal of certainty that there was some powerful sensor equipment within the Angstrom sector. Any attempt to infiltrate a large fleet formation would almost certainly be noticed rather quickly, and the Adeptus Mechanicus were likely to take exception to their presence, particularly considering their plans of starting a small war within the Magus' backyard. It would also tip off the Secessionists, who were far closer to the system than the Loyalists, meaning that any infiltration force detected too early might be overwhelmed and destroyed. Fortunately, the Magus of Angstrom saw absolutely no reason whatsoever to be surreptitious about any of his own dealings. Mass conveyors flew in a constant stream from the Forge world to an uninhabited volcano planet near the outer edges. Angstrom 13, a lifeless world racked by volcanic eruptions and constant streams of ever-changing lava. But it did have a massive starport, brought online once every 3 years for the express purpose of handing over the bounty of the system. And since it was nothing more than a glorified pit stop, there was nothing else there. No orbital weapon batteries, no las bunkers or torpedo silos, no advanced sensor equipment, nor an Adeptus Mechanicus garrison. It was the perfect site then for an ambush. Or at least, it would have been, were it not again for the fact that the entire planet was one ginormous volcanic eruption, which is probably part of the reason why there was no Mechanicus garrison, no security measures taken to safeguard this vast bounty of advanced weaponry and materiel. The planet itself would be more than enough for a security measure. Unless, of course, your enemy just so happened to have under his command Pelas Mirsan of the Salamanders chapter. To the Salamanders, the violent volcanic wrath of Angstrom 13 was but a homecoming to them, and they infiltrated the planet weeks before the Secessionists were expected to arrive to pick up their bounty. And where any other force would be dead within days, if not hours, depending upon the local geography's volatility on that particular day, the Salamanders could take it easy. They had plenty of time to reconnoiter the terrain and lay out a plan for the assault. It was to be a 3-staged operation. First, Mirsan would lead the ambush on the land-based elements that came to collect the materials. They would attack the port and overrun it, destroying as much of the Secessionist transport capacity as possible. Then, Carib Cullen would lead the fleet assets into the system to engage the Secessionists in the void, attempting to destroy yet further ships, both warships and mass transports. And then, the third and final stage, the withdrawal. The Loyalists were aware that this kind of overt action was unlikely to go unnoticed for long. The Secessionists would undoubtedly be regrouping quickly. Depending upon the size of the escort, there might even be a significant Astral Claws element along with it, which could pose a serious threat to the Salamanders. But of more immediate concern was the Mechanicus of Angstrom, whom, again, would almost certainly take a very dim view to any overt military action being taken within its borders. But there was still also, of course, the possibility that the Mechanicus might choose to not get involved at all. Even better, with the Loyalists demonstrating a show of force, attacking the Secessionists, whilst presumably leaving the Mechanicus alone, might even convince the Magos of Angstrom to finally pick a side, now that he could be reassured of the Loyalists' ascension. Wishful thinking, perhaps, but hey, optimism has only ever led a few people to the grave, right? Might as well. And there was nothing else to do until, finally, the Secessionists' bulk transport arrived in system. Detected by long-range auger arrays by Carab Cullen's warship, a message was sent down to the infiltration forces already on the surface of Angstrom 13. To get into position and prepare to attack as soon as the Secessionists had gotten underway loading up the cargo. This was the vital part of the operation, where discipline was required and found by the Salamanders. Shoot too early, and the Secessionists might simply just flee back up into orbit, leaving behind the bounty, but preventing any real damage. Shoot too late, and the prey might not only take flight, but carry all of the weapons along with it. Fortunately for Mirasan and his salamanders, the Secessionists had no reason to believe that anything was wrong. This was merely another routine pickup in a neutral system. No enemies anywhere nearby, and so they took their sweet-ass time loading up the cargo and getting it ready. By the time about half of it was on board the transport vessels and the rest was getting ready, ordered, and placed upon further conveyances, the Salamanders hit them, and they hit them hard. Concealed Thunderhawk swooped in over the starport, blasting open the perimeter walls through which Mirsan and his Salamanders swiftly flowed. The Thunderhawks then intercepted anything that tried to take off immediately, shooting it down, causing yet further catastrophic mayhem and confusion as wrecks and ordnance fell from the heavens, as flamethrowers made short work of anything else left back down on the surface. Ammunitions and weapons were ruined and destroyed in mere minutes, and personnel was slaughtered in the hundreds before the Secessionists were even aware of what was going on. By the time they had organized an identification on what exactly was attacking them, and they began trying to deploy reinforcements, Carab Cullen was launching large-scale torpedo salvos at extreme range at them in orbit, forcing them to begin hauling their massive bulks out of low orbit lest they be destroyed immediately, further delaying their immediate response, allowing the Salamanders to run amok in the poorly defended and organized planet-side elements. For a full hour, the engagement was little more than a turkey shoot for the Salamanders, who wreaked complete and utter havoc on the Secessionists' loading elements. But then, Pallas Mirsan received the order to begin the withdrawal under fire from Carab Cullen in orbit, who had just noticed the Angstrom Mechanicus fleet slipping high anchor and heading towards Angstrom 13, with full landing complements. Any attempts to communicate with the incoming Adeptus Mechanicus fleet was met only with angry bursts of binaric noise. And within an hour, Carab Cullen's fleet elements were engaged in full-scale void warfare, with Typhon-class hunter-killers assaulting their warships. And Pallas Mirsan soon found himself engaged with Adeptus Mechanicus Skitarii regiments on the surface of Angstrom 13. Indeed, the majority of the Loyalist Space Marine casualties did not occur during the ambush or the running one-hour battle thereafter, but during the heavily pressed withdrawal from the planet. Pallas Mirsan's salamanders were placed under heavy assault every step of the way back to their landing zones. Scitari and Praetorian battle servitors laying into them with heavy weaponry, more than capable of slaying even the son of Vulcan. And there was no sign of any Loyalist brotherhood, neither. The Mechanicus forces of Angstrom fully embodied the cold, merciless nature of their omniscient god, as they continued to rain down fire on the retreating Loyalists, even as they were boarding their Thunderhawks to attempt to escape back into orbit. And even when they arrived, they were still not safe, as Carab Cullen's fleet came under repeated and heavy attack by the Adeptus Mechanicus rapid reaction fleet elements. The only saving grace was that the Angstrom Mechanicus was only reacting to the combat within their borders, not to an assault upon the Secessionists, and so they assaulted both forces with equal vigor. A fortunate fact indeed, because Carab Cullen had underestimated the speed with which the Mechanicus could react, and had they chosen to stand with the Secessionists, Carab's fleet may very well have been caught in between the Adeptus Mechanicus elements and the Maelstrom squadron forces still operational in orbit. His fleet may have taken severe damage, perhaps even being crippled or outright destroyed. As it was, after gathering up the surviving salamander elements from the surface of Angstrom 13, the Loyalist fleet made an organized withdrawal away from the planet, with the Secessionists also taking the opportunity to disengage. Mechanicus, however, pursued both forces until the very edges of the system, where emergency warp jumps were then carried out. So then, what just happened here? A three-way Imperial civil war, that's what. And it wouldn't end with this either. The High Magos of Angstrom, infuriated by this blatant disregard for his territorial integrity, then started launching punitive raids into Loyalist territory, repeatedly raiding several worlds along the border. This had escalated very rapidly indeed, and whilst Carab Cullen had managed to score a victory by denying the Secessionists access to the tribute of Angstrom, the cost he was paying for it now was swiftly starting to outpace the price. And a lot of noise was being made behind the scenes as well. The Angstrom incident was threatening to expand the war yet again, bringing the Adeptus Mechanicus in, if not on the side of the Secessionists, then certainly on their own side. Remember, this entire mess began when the Warders started to champion their own rights to self-governance due to ancient Space Marine rights. The Adeptus Mechanicus had even more rights to self-rule than the Adeptus Astartes, and as far as they were concerned, those privileges had been most sorely violated by the so-called Loyalists in this autonomous zone. We can only speculate as to Carab Cullen's thoughts on the matter, but there are certain actions that happened thereafter that speaks volumes of the politicking going on behind the scenes. As Legate Inquisitor Jarndyce Frayne, of all people, had to step onto the stage and negotiate a ceasefire with the Magus of the Angstrom system, where he promised not only that the system would no longer be violated any further by any Loyalist forces, but that steps would be taken to assure that both recompense and restitution would be offered in full to the Magus at a later date, upon his holy word as one of the God Emperor's own Inquisitors. And let me tell you, that's about as close as the Inquisition will ever get to a surrender. And then, to yet further add fuel to the fires of speculation, Carab Cullen ordered the remainders of the Firehawks chapter, along with the Raptorus Rex itself and an Imperial Navy pursuit group, to be stationed just outside of the Angstrom system, should the Magos get it in his head that the restitution was not quite enough. Now that's quite the hefty security force. The Raptorus Rex was the single most powerful warship in the entirety of the autonomous zone, and it's left babysitting a single system? Man, there's some butthurt behind that decision, and make no mistake about it. I would hypothesize that Carab Cullen had kicked quite the hornet's nest and was not at all sure as to how to deal with it without causing yet further grievance. Now, sure, the Loyalists could intercept the Mechanicus raiding parties. They could engage them, they could possibly even destroy them. They might even be able to launch a full-scale invasion of the Angstrom system, but doing so would go far beyond a diplomatic catastrophe. He would probably have Carab Cullen labeled excommunicatus traitoris if he went that far. He was in between a rock and a hard place. He couldn't allow the Angstrom system to simply run berserk in his rear lines, nor could he act openly against them for fear of the political consequences. And so he had to go to the Legate Inquisitor. Oh my. I frankly think that Carab Cullen might have preferred the sentence of excommunicatus traitoris to that conversation, where he had to ask a inquisitor for help. But clearly, he swallowed his pride, and, in his credit, John Dye's Frame then stepped up and actually got a peace treaty hammered down. And hey, it wasn't his money he was signing away. But I'll tell you this much. Whoever gets the honor of ruling the autonomous zone after the Loyalists presumably get rid of Lufthuron, man, he's gonna find himself in an awful lot of debt. As for the Magos, I like the guy. He's got balls, no doubt about it. Being so sure in his position as to start kicking off a three-front war just because the kids quarrel in his backyard. That's quite the thing, and no question about it. And there was one upside to the Magos' stubborn ways. He was launching raids at everyone. Literally everyone. Even the Secessionists could not go too close to the Angstrom system without being assaulted by raging tech guard elements either. In a way, Carab Cullen had completed the encirclement of the BADAB system via the unpredictable aid of the Magos. Well, one would certainly have to be quite creative to see that as an intended consequence. Nevertheless, the reality now was that the Secessionists were fully penned into two sectors only. With the destruction of the Lamenters, the Pale Stars had slipped from the Secessionists' grasp. They now only had the BADAB system and the Endymion cluster. And after the fall of Sorengrad and the seizure of Sagan and Viania, these two systems were now completely separate from one another. The Loyalists' main aim would obviously be to reduce the BADAB system, as the Endymion cluster was viewed as a secondary priority. The only forces yet actively resisting in the area was local planetary defense militia, not Tyrant's Guard, mind you. These were actual local PDF forces under the technical command of the Mantis Warriors. The Mantis Warriors themselves, of course, were also fully operational in-system, and as they proved during the early months of the war against the Firehawks, they knew that territory like the backs of their power-armored gauntlets, and they were more than happy to make a fight out of it. Though low in numbers, they were able to repeatedly and successfully ambush Loyalist vessels as they tried to push deeper into the Endymion cluster or secure their own logistical routes. All gains, however, came at the steep cost to the Imperial Navy elements and the 2 Loyalist chapters assigned in the Endymion cluster, the Fire Angels and the Sons of Medusa. The 2 chapters, unfortunately, did not get along very well, and did not coordinate their efforts to any great extent, allowing the Mantis warriors to carry out their preferred form of hit-and-run guerrilla warfare, resulting in one of the most noteworthy incidents of this part of the war. A Fire Angel's strike cruiser, Polaris Rising, was patrolling the logistical supply routes as usual, in an area long since declared safe and outside the reach of the Mantis warriors, when, surprise, surprise, it was ambushed by a pair of Mantis warrior strike cruisers, who came upon the Polaris Rising out of a void irregularity, an area where its augers was not able to penetrate. Before they even knew what was happening, boarding torpedoes were already drilling their way into the strike cruiser, depositing large numbers of Mantis warriors under the commands of their master librarian, Al-Hasra Redith, directly into the depths of the ship's internal systems. And whilst the Fire Angels reacted as quickly as they possibly could, they had not been on a war footing. They had not been fully prepared for this, and as the onboard security details of mere mortals were swept aside with consummate ease, the Mantis warriors hit the main plasma reactors and weapons bays before withdrawing as swiftly as they had arrived, leaving the Fire Angels stunned and perplexed. Why had they withdrawn? They had breached the main plasma reactors, but they had not overloaded them. They had not detonated them. They had simply destroyed all of the operating panels. Same with the weapons. They were rendered inoperable for the time being, but they could be fixed with relative ease, provided the time was given to the repair crews. The Mantis warriors appeared to have had the Fire Angels completely at their mercy, and yet they had withdrawn. What exactly was their plans here? Maybe they had simply gotten lucky. Maybe the Mantis warriors had not expected to come across a strike cruiser. Maybe they had faced stiffer resistance than they had thought, or maybe... Hey, hold on. What's that blip on the auger readings? 2 orc kill cruisers. Or maybe that was the plan all along. Remember how I mentioned that the man leading the Mantis warriors in this strike was a librarian? Well, his full title is the Prophetic Master Librarian of the Mantis warriors, who had made it his business to know everything there was to know about the Endymion cluster and its inhabitants, to the point that now, using his psychic powers, he was able to accurately predict the movement of practically all of them, including a pair of orc kill cruisers who had been spotted in the vicinity quite recently. A pair of orc kill cruisers that immediately engaged the stricken free meal laid out in front of them. Now that's cruel. Now that is exceedingly cruel. The Fire Angels still fought back, obviously, and heroically so, even launching a counter-boarding action that saw one of the Orcish vessels gutted with the detonation of its own primary plasma drives. But eventually sheer numbers began to overwhelm the crew of the Polaris Rising. Almost all of the onboard security detail had been slaughtered in vicious and brutal close-quarters combat with hordes of green-skinned savages. The Fire Angels contingent on board, 100 battle brothers, had also fought shoulder to shoulder, back to back for hours on end, until, having been pushed back to the very last command chamber aboard their ship, 37 brothers prepared to sell their lives as dearly as possible in the name of him on Terra. Just as the auger reading picked up 2 new blips. Except these were not unidentified. These were the very self-same blips that had been firing boarding torpedoes. at the Polaris Rising a couple hours ago. The Mantis warriors had returned, but not to finish off their prey. Instead, they fell upon the sole remaining Orc strike cruiser from behind, ripping out its engine block and then taking their sweet-ass time peeling back the armor with repeated lance strikes until they dug their way into the bridge, annihilated it, and then simply kept going until the entire hulk was filled with fire and death. Then they attached towing equipment to the Polaris Rising, now completely crippled. Orc savages rampaging through all of your decks will do that to any warship, frankly. Though the Mantis warriors had at least the good graces to send over a quick Vox transmission, informing the remaining Fire Angels that they might consider themselves prisoners of war. And of circumstance. No need to lay down your weapons or anything. It's not like you can hurt us from inside of your crippled ship after all. Don't worry. We'll clean you out eventually as we take your ship as a prize of war, but, we figured you'd see light at the end of a 12-hour haul back into Mantis Warriors territory, and so they did. And to be entirely fair to the Fire Angels, no amount of heroic resistance would have saved them at this point. If the Mantis Warriors really wanted to, they could simply just have opened the ship up to the void and waited for their oxygen to run out. There really was nothing to gain from a last heroic stand here, and the Mantis Warriors had proven to be remarkably honorable opponents, besides from the constant backstabbing and ambushing anyways. But beyond these relatively rare successes, the Mantis Warriors were losing territory rapidly as the Loyalists continued to encroach upon the Endymion cluster in ever larger numbers. And it was beginning to look like only a matter of time until the remaining green sons of Jagatai Khan was all penned up in a corner, much like the Fire Angels were just now. And speaking of corners, the great and glorious tyrant of BADAB also found himself in one now. The BADAB sector was the only area of space that he now lay direct claim to. Having abandoned all the other systems, he now primarily organized his defenses around a handful of highly fortified areas within BADAB. Eshuna, Decabalus, and Isin, along of course with BADAB Primaris itself. These star systems had all been heavily fortified, as one of the tyrant's first actions was to make damn sure that no Orc raid would ever reach BADAB Primaris again. And Strategic Command on Vengeance Station estimated that the assault upon these remaining worlds would probably cost the Loyalists more blood, more casualties, and more lost warships than the entirety of the conflict so far combined. And I would like to remind you that so far it had chewed up and spat out nearly half a dozen chapters. And even that was frankly a bit of an optimistic estimate. God Emperor Law knew, after all, how many Astral Claws still remain. There was no hard number on this, though the assumption was, at the very least, a full chapter's strength. Probably 2, maybe 3, possibly 4. Though at least with the destruction of the Lamenters and the isolation of the Mantis Warriors, these forces could relatively safely be ignored. What could not be so easily swept under the rug, however, was the Tyrant's Legion and the Maelstrom Squadron. Now, the latter had been suffering heavily during the withdrawal to the BADAB system, and in running fleet engagements all across of Secessionist space. It must have been severely reduced at this point in time. As for the Tyrant's Legion, their performances in battle recently had also shown that the quality had decreased substantially from their heydays at Viania. But even so, the Tyrant was likely to be able to rely upon millions of men, and they would all be heavily entrenched in prepared, fortified positions. Even if their quality had slipped somewhat, they would absolutely have the advantage of bunkers, heavy weapons, emplacements, entrenched artillery, not to mention void defenses, battle stations, las silos, torpedoes, and everything else in between. It was going to be a mighty hard nut to crack. Even more so when you considered that whilst the Maelstrom squadron may have been heavily reduced, and the Tyrant's own fleet reserves, a couple of capital ships, a few heavy vessels at most, would be concentrated in a reserve force to counterattack the Loyalists whenever they might strike, the bigger problem was the Executioners chapter, who still had not been brought fully to bear, nor had the Loyalists been able to figure out where their base of operation was either. Now, of course, they knew about their home world, the twin worlds of Stygia Aquilon, but they had already been checked out of the case and confirmed to still be in Loyalist hands. The Executioners there had already stated that they were firm servants of the God Emperor, and the actions of their chapter master, their chief executioner, were wholly his own. Slim comfort, of course, to the Loyalists that were still heavily engaged by the Night Hag and the remainder of the Executioners. The Minotaurs in particular had suffered quite heavily after dealing with the last of the Lamenters. Worst of all was the fact that whilst the Minotaurs had originally arrived with a great deal of heavy equipment, land raiders, tanks, and landing craft, after repeated engagements with the Executioners, even their reserves were beginning to be drained rather rapidly. This was the truth for all of the Loyalist chapters, frankly, as their numbers had been severely reduced by the ferocity of the war. The Lamenters had not gone quietly. The Mantis warriors sure as hell weren't giving up, and the Astral Claws themselves had accounted for, 2 chapters now, practically? Loyalists were beginning to run out of Space Marines again, and Carab Cullen, having been cooed not once but twice now by the Legate Inquisitor, was unlikely to have any further say in who would be brought in to provide extra strength. Though Frayne most assuredly had some ideas. There are sharks out there in the cold, dark void, and I'm sure many of you have been eagerly awaiting their arrival. Next week, gentlemen. Next week. Until then, thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.